So welcome back to another one of our Anglicanism 101s. This is the last of this series. If you have followed the series throughout, I'm delighted that you did. Hope you find it interesting, helpful. I hope it stimulated thoughts, which is really what a vlog like this is meant to do anyway. Today's topic is on the future of Anglicanism. And I'm really careful about this one because I don't claim to have any great prophetic insights into what the future of Anglicanism is. I suppose all I want to do is all we ever try to do, which is to encourage you to think and to envision. So please engage in that today as we think through what Anglicanism might look like in the future. I'm going to root it in something that was said in 2013, and it was by the previous Archbishop George Carey, who's now Lord Carey. And Carey said this. He was talking about the Church of England, and he said the Church of England is just one generation away from extinction. Now that caused a stir, because you had traditional Church of England people saying, how dare he say this, our church is a beautiful institution, it will be here for forever. And then you had others who spoke more theologically and said, but surely it says in Scripture, the gates of hell will not prevail against God's church, so the church will not go extinct. Well, George Carey clarified that and said, no, I'm not talking about the church, but it's the Church of England as we know it is just one generation away from extinction. And he went on to say that church leaders, and now he's not just talking about church leaders with collars or mitres, it's all people who are involved in the leadership of churches. He said that they should be ashamed of their failure to bring particularly young people or new people into their church services. And he recognized the challenge that is not unique to the Church of England, it's a challenge across all of our churches. And that's that our churches are aging, and our churches are not representative of the communities in which they claim to serve. And his message was echoed by the Archbishop of York, who in that same year told the General Synod that compared to the needs of attracting new people into our worship, everything else that we do in our church is simply like rearranging furniture when the house is on fire. And his argument was, we have become so focused as a church on our internal differences and our internal problems that we have forgotten our primary calling, which is to reach and to care. Now that's the Church of England, but again, that could have been in reference to most of our churches. So what I want today really is twofold. I want today to, in our first section, think about what are the challenges that Anglicanism faces today. What are the internal and external struggles that we as a church are wrestling with, that are tied up in our future as a church. And then, having thought about some of our challenges and our struggles as we go forward, I want us to think about what our opportunities are and ways in which the Anglican tradition can breathe life into the world in which it serves. So, some of our challenges. I think Anglicanism, like so many things in life, our virtues can quite quickly become our vices or our challenges. So our parish model, which is meant to ground faith in a sense of place, is struggling to adapt to changes in technology and new population centres that are emerging throughout our communities. Our speed of change and our sense of continuity and embracing not just the future but the past is perhaps not keeping pace with the evolution that we see in our societies. I was at a meeting just a few nights ago And someone observed that the Church of Ireland way, when faced with a challenge, is often to set up a committee and then to write a report. And then by the time the committee has been established and the report has been written, the issue is yesterday's issue, and society has already started to move on. And one of our other virtues is our embrace of divergence and our embrace of a multitude of opinions, our comfort with our breadth, our rejection of fundamentalism and narrow views. And that's a brilliant thing, but it's also a thing that's resulting in fracture and internal dispute without the suitable mechanisms to resolve those disputes. So I want to think about our challenges in two areas, and one is the external challenges, the challenges that exist in the world outside of our doors, but also maybe some of the more internal challenges that are unique to us. So external challenges, and maybe I can think of three. First one is the rise of secularism. Once upon a time in the life of church, everyone belonged to a church. Didn't mean they all went to a church, but everyone belonged to a church. And just by nature of opening their doors on a Sunday morning, churches could guarantee a collateral of people arriving. And that's not the case anymore. And the data is alarming. The recent CSO statistic shows us that amongst young people, 1 in 5 young people in Ireland no longer claim any religious affiliation at all. And that's an alarming statistic for Ireland, but actually Ireland is still quite church going and church attached when compared to the rest of Europe. Statistics show quite clearly that young adults and young people today are increasingly loosening their religious affiliations. And churches can no longer simply live on their reputations, that we are the church and therefore we will always be the church. And I hear sometimes this lean which says, oh, our young people will, that's what they say as young adults, but as they get older they find their way back to church. Well, statistics have shown, at least in England, that has not been the case for the last generation. And not only have belief systems changed, but also people's patterns of attendance at churches have changed. Even people who claim to have a religious identity, statistics show a very low percentage ever find their way to a pew or ever find their way to a church activity. And that is a challenge for us. Second challenge are technological and cultural changes. Now, Anglicanism has always been built on a sense of place. We talk about the parish, and people of traditional Church of Ireland or Anglican stock are very wed to this word parishioner, and it's a fine word. But populations historically lived in parishes. And parishes were not only ecclesial or churchy centres, but they were always modes for administrative and civic purposes. And to some extent we still see this in Ireland, because schooling is still very attached to a parish system. But the reality is that the parish system is dissolving. Someone wrote an article a while back, I have no idea who it was, but they suggested that the moment everyone had access to a car, the parish system ceased to function, because people could now drive to the church of their choice. And populations are moving. And populations are often moving away from the church place. How often do you go to somewhere and you see a beautiful church building, but it's miles away from the central population, the hub of a town? How often do you go to a rural community perhaps and you find a cathedral that is in the middle of a field somewhere, far away from where people actually live? So often our churches have not kept in touch with the sense of changing place. And that's been extended even further with changes in technology. Look, we've seen this during COVID. There are young people that are no longer going out and playing on the streets with a kid a few streets away from them, but they're sitting on their laptop playing Fortnite with a child in Japan. And the reality is technology has made us more global. We talk about the need to access things immediately. Even in church life, people talk about network churches as much as they talk about local churches. And some churches are, when it comes to technology, correctly but critically embracing those changes. But it is a challenge. The world around us is changing. We see the rise of secularism. We see a new understanding of a sense of place. We see evolving technology. And in some ways, we as a church have not been geared towards that. The last external challenge, before we jump into some of our own internal challenges, of course, but a huge external challenge for us as a church is simply a loss of credibility. In Ireland, as across the globe, we have not been strangers to church scandals. And even recently, we have been aware of our need to apologize for the sins of the past. And we're not on our own. Not only are religious institutions struggling with credibility, but all institutions today are struggling with credibility. And we shouldn't put our head in the sand and imagine that's going to go away, because I don't think it is. But we need to find a new language, the new speech of humility, a step away from entitlement, and we need to explore what authority looks like when your credibility is tarnished. So there are some of the external challenges. Let's think a moment about some of those challenges that are more internal to us. And some of those are very practical. The church wrestles right now with finance and with increased bureaucracy. At a time whenever people on pews are reducing, the financial struggles of churches are increasing. These beautiful buildings that we have, that are a wonderful legacy of the stewardship of the past and the imagination of the past, are ridiculously expensive to run. And churches now, if they are to do business properly, need not only to run their services, but need to be charities. And that subjects them to charity legislation, to data protection requirements, to suitable financial reporting, to safeguarding trust. And those things are all important and we affirm them, but they bring huge demands on our churches in terms of how we finance that and resource that. And again, what I find is churches, perhaps particularly smaller churches, saying, we would love to be doing missional things in our community. We would love to be growing, but all of our resources are simply put into keeping our building afloat. We dread the day when someone says to us, your roof is inadequate, and suddenly a church that is skint has to raise $250,000 to fix a roof. And these are practical things, but they are challenges for us, and they are internal challenges for us. We need to wrestle with making sure our house is in order. But there are also internal battles that are debated within the church. And that's nothing new. There's always been debate within the church. But in recent years, there has been a concern at the very highest level in our churches over the future of a church that's experiencing deep and, for some people, irreconcilable internal conflicts. First, perhaps, around gender, around the ordination of women clergy, and then around human sexuality. And often, although I simplify, but often they have been a tension between what we might oversimply refer to as conservative and liberal perspectives within the church. So women priests, for example. The ordination of women in the Anglican Communion has been increasingly has been a norm in provinces since the 1970s. Ireland, just in November there, celebrated 30 years of the ordination of women. And in general, that is welcomed and affirmed, and I have no doubt that our church has been hugely enriched by women clergy and throughout the church at multiple levels. But of course, there have been those who disagreed with this. And the Church of England, for example, has created an office of provincial episcopal visitors that are often known as flying bishops, to minister to clergy and laity and parishioners who do not in good conscience accept the ministry of women priests. And that's been a battle in the church between traditionalists, both from the evangelical and the Anglo-Catholic tradition, and more progressive views. In some ways, within the Church of Ireland, I think that tends to not be a huge issue for us. But more recently, the church has been deeply split and has struggled over how it navigates what we may call the gay issue, particularly in the ordination of clergy who are gay. So, the Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conference is a big gathering that happens every 10 years, or roughly every 10 years, and it brings together bishops from all across the Anglican Communion, all across the world, and it's convened by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's one of what we refer to as our symbols of Anglican unity. It brings together divergent voices from all across the world for mutual learning and discussion on resolutions and priorities. In 2008, 4 Anglican primates announced that they intended to boycott the Lambeth Conference because of their opposition to the actions of the Episcopal Church in America, who had voted in favour of homosexual clergy and same-sex unions. Instead, what they did is they set up what they called the Global Anglican Future Conference, became known as GAFCON, which happened just a month before Lambeth in 2018. And it was a meeting of conservative, predominantly evangelical bishops, and it was held in Jerusalem. And although they didn't claim that it was meant to be so, it was seen by many as an alternative Lambeth Conference. And it claimed its purpose was to address the growing controversy of the divisions in the Anglican Communion. It was there to address the rise of secularism, as well as concerns over HIV and AIDS and poverty. And as a result, it produced what became known as the Jerusalem Declaration. And the Jerusalem Declaration urged the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I quote, not to invite bishops of those provinces which had endorsed by word or deed sexual practices which are in contradiction to the teaching of Scripture. And although GAFCON did not decide to create a formal schism in the Anglican Communion, it did express plans to set up new ecclesial structures, particularly within the liberal provinces of North America, to cater for conservative Anglicans. Actually, it's a very tricky one. This series is called Anglicanism 101. And we talked right at the first session about how that word Anglican carries baggage. Well, it carries baggage in the US also, because in the US we refer to the Episcopal Church in America, but the alternative provisions that have been established in North America have tried to embrace the word Anglican as a much more conservative movement. So it has baggage there that may not be true to its actual name or how we might understand it. But the reality is this issue is not going away. And recent archbishops of Canterbury have focused on trying to very simply maintain Anglican communion, maintain the union of the Anglican Church in the midst of these deep theological and cultural differences between provinces and traditions. So liberal Anglicans wish to push ahead and be be a gay affirming church, a church affirming for all people. And the conservative voices are pushing back hard and saying that no, the church needs to refind its scriptural heritage. And it's hard to know where this one is going. And the great fear of global Anglicanism is the fear of schism. And the thing that we need to find, perhaps in the midst of all of that, is grace and understanding, and a new way in the midst of an incredibly fractured world to have genuine and good conversation. So listen, there are some of the challenges facing Anglicanism as it moves forward. Some of them are issues of our own making. Many of them are issues of external change and how we adapt to that. I think, though, there's lots of reasons to be optimistic, and there are lots of opportunities for us as a church. So maybe we'll move in to think about some of those opportunities. So what are the opportunities for the Anglican Church? Listen, I've just spoken for 15 minutes about the challenges, but I'm Anglican because I believe in what we stand for and who we are. I didn't grow up Anglican. I mentioned that in an earlier edition, but I became Anglican. It was originally through the Episcopal Church in the US when I lived in Seattle, and we found a home in a wonderful, vibrant cathedral there. But then we moved back to Dublin, and I felt the call of the Church of Ireland. And the question that folk have said to me is, why did you gravitate towards the Anglican Church? There are probably lots of reasons, and often things happen circumstantially and practically, but what pulled me towards the Anglican Church is the sense that we are not afraid to have conversations. We may not always have them well, and we may sometimes air our laundry in public much more than we would like to, but at least we're able to have conversations. And in a world where the spaces where conversations happen are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, I think we have the scope to model how to do conversation well. I also genuinely believe that we have the resources within us, with God's guidance, to rise to the challenges that we see in society today. So what does the Anglicanism of the future look like? Well, a few things I think it needs to do if it's going to meet the challenges ahead. Firstly, the Anglicanism of the future, I think, will be much more agile and flexible than it has been historically. And that shows up in a number of ways. Firstly, it will need to be more agile and flexible liturgically. And we've already seen that in most of our churches. In our world, people are now second generation non-church going. The language of church is not present in people's vocabulary. So we are going to need to seek new ways liturgically to ensure that people outside the doors of our church understand what happens when they enter. And that's a very simple thing, but it's true. We need once again to be a church in the language of the people. And that's going to show itself in terms of what we do when we gather for worship. And it's a hard thing for us, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but we need to recognize a need for agility and flexibility in how we do worship. There'll also be an agility and flexibility in simply how we do church. We see churches now popping up all over the place, churches in coffee shops, churches in the basements of community centres, churches in people's homes. And for a lot of traditional Anglican people, that's just seen as very good, but not real church. Real church involves robes and kneeling and choirs and evensong. And listen, those things are wonderful. But we need to get over that that's the only way church can look. If our church is going to be vibrant moving forward, we need to be more agile and flexible in terms of how we reach people. The Diocese of London is one of the dioceses that has bucked the trend in recent years in church decline over in England, because the church in London is growing, and there's lots of reasons for that. But one thing that they've been very intentional is in building faith communities that don't have pointy roofs, in resourcing practitioners who will be brave enough to start churches in estates and with new communities, to go slightly outside the doors of our traditional stone buildings and to be church within communities. And that needs the blessing and permission of church leadership. But we're seeing that. We're seeing much more of an inclination for churches to invest and resource people who are pioneering. And that moves me to the next thing. The Anglicanism of the future is going to need to be much more missional. Now, in our DNA, we should always have been missional, and that is perhaps one of the crimes of our church, that we separated the role of the church and the mission societies. But the church is always missional. The church is part of God's mission. And particularly today, we live in a society that we call post-Christendom. And what I mean by that is, perhaps at one point in our society, everyone knew the basics of Christian principles. But that's no longer so. Mission is no longer what happens over there. As a church, we need to recognize that mission needs to be what happens here. And that has implications for how we train clergy, that has implications for how we resource ministry, that has implications for how we do programs. The good old established church needs to have a missional focus. A question needs to be asked of all of our programs. This program is good, but how is it reaching out to bless our community? The third thing that I think Anglicanism will look like in the future is that I think there will be a greater loosening of our power and entitlement. And for some people, we fight that because we think as a church, by nature of being established, although we are not the established church, but by nature of being established, we should have certain rights and entitlements. People in church leadership, we know that's gone. When a clergy person walks down the street with a collar around his neck, it's no longer something which opens up potential for ministry, but often it simply shuts it down. There has been a loosening of power and a loosening of authority. And we have choices. We can fight that, we can try our best to use our power to demand that, or we can recognize that it's changed. And we can recognize that maybe the church is at its best when it's at its weakest. And there's a biblical principle there that our strength is found in our weakness, because it's in our weakness that we rely on Christ. When the church thinks that it's powerful, it tends to be at its worst. And what I sense we will find is a return to the church as a movement. Much less the church as an institution, but the church as a movement towards justice, a movement towards care of the vulnerable, a movement that I believe if we do it well, people will get on board with. But a movement needs to be agile and flexible and missional. The last thing that I hope Anglicanism becomes as we go forward is increasingly diverse. We know that our own society is changing, but our Anglicanism has changed significantly. You know, in the 1900s, more than 80% of Anglicans lived in Britain, and about 1% of Anglicans globally lived in sub-Saharan Africa. Today, a majority of Anglicans, 55% of the world's Anglicans, live in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that's an amazing success story for Africa and for how Africa has embraced its missional roots. It's also a shameful story for the rest of Europe and for the rest of the world, because we haven't, and we've allowed our churches to dwindle. And that has huge implications for how we do church. Actually, the conversation we had earlier in regards to some of our challenges, particularly on those sort of ethical issues around gender and homosexuality, is being played out on that shift on the global stage also. Because often the African churches, and not always, but we may suggest that they tend to be somewhat more conservative in comparison with the much more theologically liberal North. But we need to hear that as a reality for us as a church. There is a need to embrace new voices from sub-Saharan Africa. If they are the majority of our church, we need to be, to some extent, reflective on perspectives. That needs to have some impact on how we do liturgy, on how we do gathering. And we need to listen. And we know also in Ireland, many churches will say our areas of growth as churches here has been in the embrace of new communities. And we as a church are blessed when we see increased diversity. The other thing that I think we can embrace is the intergenerational nature of our churches. Now that may seem like a contradiction, because I said earlier that our churches are getting older and older, and that is alarming and true. But our churches are also one of the few places in society where the young and the old potentially can gather together. And we need to receive each other, and we need to model what it looks like for people to be together. Our age, I think, and I'm going to start wrapping this whole series up. The age that we live in, I think, is thirsting for something that the church offers. And maybe if we can transcend our own internal challenges, and if we can focus not on the changes in our society as, isn't this a terrible problem for us, isn't society awful, but actually recognize that that is the mission field in which we live. I think the church has the potential to offer belonging and community and hope and good news and genuine, authentic conversation in our communities again. This is a phase in the life of the church where more so than ever the church needs courage, and the church needs to move in the power of the Spirit. But I'm hopeful. I hope you are also. God's blessing to you. Delighted you were part of this series. Always curious to know what your thoughts are on these issues. You're welcome to leave things in comments. You're welcome to sidebar with me on any of these issues. But I bid you well, and I pray for you God's blessing. Take care.